to see who joins. Yeah, we're live now. And that's all good. Just wait a couple more minutes. Good shout, Ben. Just wait a couple more minutes, see if anyone else is joining. Just for the people who are here, this session is being recorded and live streamed. So if you want to change your name or keep your camera off, that's fine. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand in the reactions button at the bottom throughout the session, or you can just pop the questions in the chat at any moment, or you can save them to Jen. It's up to you. And we'll just wait a couple more minutes for see if anyone else is joining. And then we'll start.
I think I've got big shoes filled after, I think it's, I cannot say a name because it's so complicated.
I think it's Suchandrika. I think that's how you say it. It's a very beautiful name, I think.
Very Indian name, that's for sure. Sukharinda. I won't say the fear of embarrassing myself, but I won't embarrass myself anyway.
I think we'll start in just a minute, and then if anyone else joins, they can just catch up. Let me just grab my question.
I've already got the questions on my second screen, so.
Brilliant. Okay, I think let's just start. You can start by introducing yourself, what you do, your experience, etc. Go ahead.
So, thank you very much, Francis. In most of my spare time, and I do a master's in data journalism at BCU outside of that. So I've been a journalist now for nearly a decade, actually, 8 years, in fact. And it's been quite a bit of a revelation because I never really wanted to get into data journalism. I kind of think it was an opportunity that I created through my undergrad at university, where I was kind of introduced to data journalism. And from there, because I originally wanted to be a sports journalist, so moving from sports to data was quite a big move. But I think right now I would have not made that decision unless I did my degree at BCU in doing so. So I think one of the reasons why I love data is you can tell so many stories, and it's also about telling those narratives within those stories. Data is just not data is not numbers, it's just people at the end of the day, and every person has a story to share. If you see what I mean.
Sorry, I was muted. I said, yeah, absolutely. I completely understand. So you said that you got into data journalism with your undergraduate degree, but can you explain to us first, so just in case anyone doesn't know, what is data journalism?
So it's quite a difficult subject to understand because data journalism, I think, has
We're
very
having
different
some.
things, because you sort of think graphs, that's data journalism and journalism. But if I could put it in a simple way, hello?
Yeah, we were just having some trouble. I think it was lagging a little bit.
Yeah, I've just moved my laptop a bit. So I was going to say about data journalism. So data journalism involves working with databases, and also doing your own analysis when it comes to finding data and trying to create stories within that data. So it's what data journalism is finding stories with data. So let's just say, for example, you're working on a crime story about stop and search, and you want to look at how stop and search increased over the last 3 years in a particular police force. So what you would do is you'd grab all the data from from datapolice.uk, and then you would sort of try and do your own analysis to see if stop and search has increased or decreased over the last 3 years. So it's mostly about telling stories with numbers and databases, or data sets as they're known.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm pretty sure it's very useful. What kind of articles do you write with that data?
So there's a lot of things you can write with data. You can do quick turnaround stories where it's sort of an increase or a decrease, which involves change essentially. You could do an easy ranking story with council has spent or underspent its money on sort of council budgets, so particular local services. Features and investigation, so you could sort of do a deep dive into how that system works essentially, so, and how that system is failing to sort of to hold things to account. So there's a lot of things you can do with data. So, and it's not just restricted to investigations. It is also, you can also do it with features and quick turnaround news stories. So it is very flexible in terms of how you get your stories, but you have to do the groundwork first.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And how did you get into data journaling? Because you mentioned it was through your undergraduate course. How did you find it and get passion for it?
I think one person springs to mind, and that's Paul Bradshaw, who is a well-known person in the data journalism field, and somebody that was one of the most influential people who got me into data journalism in the first place, because I was looking at some stories that were done around using data, and I just thought, wow, I could do some stories with that. That sounds fascinating, because I was doing a lot of sports stories for the student magazine at the time, and I wanted to try and find a USP that would actually stand me out from the crowd. And what I found was very useful was throughout my undergrad trying to do data stories through from the middle of my first year to the final year, and then into industry. And whilst I haven't had the time to do much data stories in the jobs I've had, what I've always tried to do is try and use my data skills to try and tell stories in a journalism. You need to keep your skills sharp, so that at least you're not having to essentially lose that ability. So if you're working with a programming tool, you need to keep using it so that you don't get rusty, or you don't lose that ability to tell stories with data.
Yeah, I could hear most of what you said, but there's some bits in between that are kind of lagging, I imagine, because of the Wi-Fi. But yeah, I think overall I did get most of the idea that you wanted to get through. And from then on, then you said before that you went straight into the industry. So how did you progress from going from university into the field of um, data journalism? How do you progress from there?
Well, it's not really data journalism. Well, it was just technically mostly journalism. I did mostly data journalism in my spare time because I think most of my jobs that I did in the industry, even though they weren't very long, involved me having to do research and find out about stuff. So, so I think data journalism was always on the side in case I just needed it. So it was always sort of there. I think what happened was I was a technology journalist, and I still am a technology journalist to some degree, but it's almost kind of when you're working in the industry, you're not always going to work in your desired field. And I think I sort of knew that when I had my data journalism sort of USP. I think it was sort of a nice to have, but if I manage it, so it's about just being flexible with the skill set and trying to create opportunities for yourself, whether that's through creating your own platform for yourself to write data stories, or in my case, freelancing and seeing where the road takes you.
Yeah, and I had a question and just slipped my mind. Um, and how does the having that specific topic that you are maybe an expert on, but you like writing, how does that open doors for you in terms of freelance journalism?
I think in terms of that is, I think having that beat is incredibly important because I think I'll admit it. I'm a very good interviewer, so interviews are very come very naturally to me. So I can easily pitch something to a publication and say, look, I've interviewed this person. Would you be interested in having this piece in it? And they're usually quite supportive. But when it comes to data stories, it's you're having to have that balancing act because it is very hard work, data journalism, and I think you have to think about how much money you're going to get out of it because it is expensive. It if you don't get somewhere with the story, it can feel like you've just wasted your time trying to get a story for nothing. So I think you need to set your expectations at a realistic level if you're going to specialize in that beat.
Okay. Yeah, I had no idea um, that it was hard to go into that specifically, but I see what your point. I see what you mean. Um, so, what are the main skills that you need to become a data journalist?
I think I can boil it down to five. You need to have persistence because with FOIs and trying to get the data, it's not always going to be publicly available. So you need to have that persistence to follow what with public bodies
Sorry, I think we kind of missed you there.
and that data. Yeah, I think my Wi-Fi is just behaving ridiculously, but I'll say what I need to say. But I think you need to sort of have that skill set to essentially work work from a base that you're going to need a lot of persistence, particularly when it comes to getting data sets. I would also say you need to have a basic level of numeracy.
Hmm.
Data journalism is one of those things where you have to no you have to write, but you also need to know how to analyze data and dissect it. So I think I've made mistakes with my data analysis, which would have made my stories either misleading or completely factually incorrect. So you have to give your analysis a double sense check just to make sure that they're all correct and get somebody to have a fresh pair of eyes. I think number three, you need to be able to know how to tell those stories with data. Data journalism, as I've said at the start, is about people, and people want to be told stories. They don't want to read through a story that's just full of numbers. That's just very dry. You need to be able to humanize that story.
Yeah.
And finally, I probably would say you need to be able to have that lifelong, you need to be a lifelong learner. There's no point just learning a couple of tools and saying, oh, that's it, I'm done. You need to learn a bit of everything, even though if you're specializing in a couple of tools, which is great, but always keep your eyes open for new tools that come across the spectrum or the scene, if you were.
Yeah, I think it makes sense that you would want like balance in your stories, not just simply data. So I think actually it takes a lot of skill on knowing how to um, make that data as accurate as possible and as interesting as possible, but then trying to find a story within the data and finding the people to interview. And I think that's definitely something very interesting that I would definitely like to sort of have a look as well, and try to get into that a little bit, because like you said, you need to learn, you need to keep learning and adapting, if things change. um, my next question is sort of similar to this, and you've mentioned this one, you mentioned about learning, but what kind of tools or like programming languages do you need to learn to be able to be a data journalist?
I think the first tool you need to learn is Excel and Google Sheets. Excel, you need to learn to love Excel, even though Excel is probably the most laborious and boring sort of tool you can use. Because I think when journalists work with numbers, they're almost sort of like, numbers? What do you mean numbers? I just want to write a story, but unless you learn Excel, you're just never going to get into data journalism. And I would say, in terms of big data, you need to learn R and SQL and the command line, because those tools will save you a ton of time when it comes to data analysis and working with data sets that are quite large. And then when it comes to the front end, I think you need to learn tools such as Flourish and Infogram and Data Wrapper, which are very good because then you can visualize data in a blink of an eye. And then if you're feeling very adventurous, then I probably would say looking at JavaScript and HTML and CSS, as well as potentially Tableau and another tool and QGIS for mapping. So there's a lot of tools to learn, but you just have to make sure that you pick the tools that fit your skill set. Don't try and just learn all those skills and programming languages at once. Pick two or three skills or two or three tools or programming languages you want to learn, and then go off and do that. So just don't spread yourself too thin, essentially, when it comes to learning new skills and programming languages in data journalism.
Okay, and how and are all these programs free? Do you have to pay for any of them, or like how do you manage to get all of these tools under your belt?
I think some of them are cheap, some of them are you do have to pay a bit of a premium, but I think it just depends on how you want to learn and what tools will get you to your destination, not just quickly, but in the time that you want to get to that destination. Data journalism is a bit like a journey. You're going to be going through loads of chicanes and sharp right-handers and left-handers, but it's not a straight line, because particularly when you're learning new tools and programming languages, you need to make sure that A, you know what you're doing, and B, the tools you're using will get you to that destination and will help you tell that story quickly, whether that's through your data analysis or your visualizations, to eventually writing up the full story.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it as a journey. I think that was a very interesting way um, to get your point across. Overall, do you have any advice or tips on how to build a profile in the industry?
I think the first tip start a blog, or start a blog is probably my main advice, because I think even though there's a lot of news organizations and magazines who are starting to get onto data journalism now, it's still a relatively new industry that's still growing. So I think having a blog and then blogging about your favorite subject using data to tell those stories is a great way of not only building your profile in the industry, but also getting your name out there to potential editors. Because if they can see that you can tell stories using data, they're more likely to commission you for stories or take you on. And I would probably say one of my tips for getting into data journalism, as I've said before, just keep learning. I think you need to be able to learn on the fly, whenever you're able to, when you've got a small data set or a large data set, you need to be able to adapt quickly to telling those stories, whether it's a quick turnaround story or a long form investigation.
Okay, and when you're like pitching stories, how do you come up with the ideas? Do you find the data first and then you build an idea through there, or do you think of the idea and then look for the data? And also, how do you know who to pitch to as well?
So I think you have to start off with the idea first before the analysis. That's an essential. You want to build a hypothesis for your argument, and just to see what's happening with the data, seeing has how many laptops are being delivered to schools by the government via local authority in England is a very good example. Or how many bike crimes have been committed, how many bike thefts have been committed in terms of crime. So I think it's quite important that you think about the idea first before you actually do any form of data analysis or anything that involves working with data. So you need to have a good idea of what you want to do before you get the data and analyze it and turn it into a story.
Okay, that makes sense. Um, so, what are the main challenges of doing data journalism or the industry itself?
It's still a relatively new industry, and data journalism has been around for a couple of centuries actually. Data journalism used to be known as computer assisted reporting in the 60s and 70s, and then it moved into data journalism now. So I think it's still a relatively new and growing industry, but also one of the other challenges is just, I think it's sort of convincing publishers that data journalism is a great way of telling stories, because um, journalism is not cheap, and with sort of costs being cut to publishers, you need to think about how can I upskill myself in the best way so that I'm resilient to further job cuts, or I'm resilient to uncertainties that are facing the industry. So you have to be adaptable, because if you're not adaptable in data journalism, it can just chew you up and spit you out in an instant.
Okay. And if you if anyone who's watching wants to start looking into data journalism, do you have any recommendations of good articles to read or good places to go to find those pieces of data journalism?
I think some of the best pieces of data journalism I've read, particularly, I think, is part of the local news. I think it's part of the BBC sort of news network. So they're very good at telling those stories using data for local publishers and also BBC News website. So I'd probably start there. I would also say, in particular, I would probably say, just trying to think, I would also say looking at bloggers who specialize in data journalism, so the online journalism blog from Paul
I think
Bradshaw
it's sort of lagging again. Sorry.
is a great web. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
So yeah, I think the online journalism blog from Paul Bradshaw is brilliant because I think Paul is a leading sort of expert in the field of data journalism and is someone that I've known for many a year. So he's able to sort of bring together some really good resources on data journalism and some good tips on how to be a good data journalist. I think immerse yourself in it, whether that's through the Guardian, Sky News, BBC News, Telegraph, you name it. I think you just have to immerse yourself in it so that you know what sort of stories that they're covering and how you can pitch them in a different way to editors.
Okay. Thanks. That was really good. Ben, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah. What do you think has been like the most interesting story you've ever worked on?
Where do you start, really? Probably would say the first data journalism story I ever did was on the Rugby World Cup when it was in England in 2015, and it was looking into the number of West Midlands players in Rugby World Cup squads since 1987. And that was quite a fascinating story because I was taking a very national story, global story on the Rugby World Cup, and then trying to localize it in a way using data. So I think what happened was Paul sort of managed to help scrape the data, and then I had to do my own sort of analysis and sort of visualizing the data, and then I managed to turn it into a really good infographic which explained the story in a very visually appealing way, and it happened to be probably one of my favorite data journalism stories I ever did. But if I had to look back on that story with hindsight, I wish I could have interviewed somebody from the West Midlands who played in the Rugby World Cup for England, because I think it would have added that colour and human element to the story. And I kind of am defeating my own advice in terms of humanising the story, but I think that story really does stick out to me as one of my favourite stories I've ever done on that subject.
Do you think it feels to me like sport would be something quite difficult to sort of get data journalism stories about. Do you find that that's the case, or is it actually easier than you might expect?
Very easy, in fact. I probably would say a lot of good data journalism stories are around football, for example. So BBC Sports Price of Football is a great example of that, which sort of looks at the price of football for each football club in England. So I would say that's a great example of data journalism. But also as well, the FT has done some really good stuff on data journalism with sport, in particular football and Formula One. So I think sport is probably one of the easiest subjects to cover in terms of using data, because there's just such an abundance of it. So I would probably say it's not as difficult as you really think.
On the reverse of that, what would be like one of the most difficult to sort of find data journalism stories about?
Technology. I think technology is probably one of the most difficult because the data is not particularly accessible. So you have to do quite a lot of digging to find the data. And this is coming from a technology journalist who who hasn't really done much data stories. I've done stories where I've looked into tenders contracts and managed to find gold from that. But I think technology is probably one of the hardest to cover because it's very broad, and also as well, the chances of you getting the data, because they are private companies, is very slim.
You talked a bit about freedom of information requests before, which obviously is something quite a lot of our members have some experience of. Often doing like FOIs for their student papers and stuff will be the first time they've ever really done anything like that. Did you find it was quite hard to adapt to doing that, or did you sort of like, did it take you a while to learn the sort of tips and tricks of getting people to not say, "Oh, that's too expensive, we can't give you that information," or did you find it was quite an easy sort of change to make?
I think freedom of information is one of those areas that is a bit difficult to do because you need to be very specific in what you want and how you want the data to be formatted. Because I think unless you make those specific requests, such as you want this spreadsheet in a CSV format or an Excel workbook, or you want this data formatted in a certain way that you're requesting, you're never going to get the data, or you're never going to get the information you want. I think in my experience, I haven't used freedom of information very much in my career because I've done a lot of technology journalism, and sports journalism, but it is an area I'm still trying to improve in. So, and I think I've always said from the start, you need to keep improving as a data journalist. So you don't really know everything, if you see what I mean.
One of the questions which was asked yesterday quite a lot in the Northern Spark, which I watched, was all the panelists, or not panelists, but speakers, got asked like what the best piece of advice they'd ever got was. So I'm going to turn that around and ask you the question. So, what do you think the best piece of advice you've ever been given for your career is?
Is that from a journalism context or a data journalism context?
Both. I'm going to make it hard and make you do both.
Oh, I think I've had a lot of great advice in my career. I probably would say never be afraid to say that you don't know anything, because I think if you come in with the mindset that you know everything in journalism, you're just going to fall flat on your face. So I think it's quite important that whenever you come into a new job in journalism, particularly when you're working in an industry like data journalism, or as I've done previously, doing briefly in B2B magazines, you're not going to know everything, but at the end of the day, if you can get a surface level knowledge of that subject and then learn as you go along, it'll hold you in good stead. So just be curious and don't assume that you know everything, because you don't.
I've got a question as well. I've been thinking about the question since you mentioned something earlier when you were talking about how data journalism is always developing. So where do you see it going next, the whole data journalism industry?
I think where I'm sort of seeing it at the moment is there's a lot of really good sort of platforms at the moment who do very good data journalism. So Tortoise is probably one of my favorite platforms at the moment, and they seem to be doing really good data journalism, which is under a paywall. I think where we're going at the moment is you've got some sort of outlets which act as a service providers. So you'll see the sort of data journalism as a service to the newsroom, and then you'll have fully fledged data journalism departments which actually do data investigation. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that as it sort of unfolds over the years. But what I would definitely like to see is more sort of startup publishers specializing in data journalism, because I think right now, as sort of the legacy media, as I would like to say, the newspapers and broadcast media, I think we need to sort of start seeing more things like the Bureau of Investigative Journalism come up, because I think if we can have that media plurality, excuse me, I cannot say plurality quite well, but if we have that media plurality, we will it will make data journalism much easier to thrive and survive, especially at a time where journalism seems to be in decline, sort of. But I think journalism has always been in decline for a very long time anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that. My next question was, what do you see in your future in terms of as a journalist? Are you going to continue working in data journalism, or do you plan to take up any other types of journalism?
I think, interestingly, I'm still interested in data journalism as much as the ordinary layman on the street. But what I've been exploring more recently is the use of games in journalism, and making games in a way that people can understand how systems work. So I think that's quite a fascinating area, and it's one of the things that I'm quite interested in at the moment. So usually after work, I'm usually on my PlayStation trying to play a game and just trying to see what can I use from that game that I can use to create a game with. So it's thinking about how can we engage younger audiences who are more likely to play games and try and convert them into journalism? Because I think one of the issues at the moment is trying to engage young people in journalism, because it's very social native, but I think games have a lot of untapped potential to engage people in journalism, and I think it's an area that's gonna become more common, actually, if the issues of funding become less relevant, which it is.
Yeah, that's a very original idea. I've never even thought about it that way, but I see how that would definitely start engaging a different kind of people who might want to get interested in journalism, but don't really know where to start. And that leads me to my next question, which is like, let's say I want to start working with data journalism. Where should I start? Like, what should I do first?
I think the first thing you should do is get yourself on a master's course in data journalism. There's not many data journalism courses other than City, Cardiff, and BCU. So I'd probably recommend doing a master's course in that, and then getting yourself drilled into the basics of data journalism is probably my main bit of advice I'd give, because unless you do a master's course specifically in data or computational journalism, yes, doing a normal journalism degree is great, but if you don't spend the spare time doing data journalism on the side or updating your GitHub repo, what's really the point of entering data journalism if you're not really practicing it anyway?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Ben, do you have any more questions you'd like to ask?
I still can't properly unmute myself, and it's only 10 months into the pandemic, so that's all right. Yeah, do you think this is the data journalism is one of like the key routes journalism has to take if it wants to sort of survive in what is a more technological, detached, less sort of print heavy world?
I think yes, because I think what the coronavirus pandemic has shown is that data is pretty much an essential, really, for reporting in journalism. So what I would sort of recommend is just to get your data dictionary sorted, learn Excel, learn Google Sheets, learn how to visualize data, and try and tell stories with that. Because I think if you don't have data skills in your toolbox as a journalist now, you're going to find it really difficult to sort of survive in the industry.
Is there anything more that you'd like to say that we haven't touched on, or that you think it's important to mention regarding journalism in general or data journalism itself?
I think the main bit I'm going to give to you is sort of punctuality in journalism, and I think particularly when you're working with deadlines, never be late. I know journalists have a habit of being late for getting stories done, but if you're late for stories, if you get your story out at 11, if you get your story out at 12:01 and your deadline was 12 o'clock, your editor's not going to be very happy with you. So you need to be mindful of how you get stories done, but also set yourself smart goals which are specific, measurable, achievable, time bound, realistic and time bound. So just sort of set those goals in mind, and then you'll be able to get those stories done without running around like a house of fire, wondering, oh my goodness, I've got to get this story in and I haven't done much work with it. So don't put yourself under unintentional pressure to get the story done. I've had experiences where I think my news instinct got the better of me. So you need to sort of just take a step back, calm down, and then just focus on the story rather than try and get it in quickly. Because sometimes the person who gets the story in first isn't likely to have the most accurate story. So you're better off spending the extra time trying to get the story right rather than get the story wrong.
Yeah.
Definitely, you're absolutely right. Ben, you were going to ask anything?
No, I was just saying I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, definitely. So if there's anything else that you want to say, you can go ahead. But I don't have any more questions unless Ben's got anything else. No.
In that case, if you've got no questions to ask, we'll wrap up there.
Yeah, we've got our awards for anyone who's watching our live stream. We've got our awards happening on Twitter at SPA Journalism at 7:30 p.m. tonight. So tune in for that if you're nominated, and even if you aren't, but just interact with us. It's going to be very exciting, and I guess we'll see you there. Thank you so much, Umar, for speaking on data journalism. I've learned quite a lot today. And I think it was a very interesting session. And for everyone who's watching our live stream, I'm sure they'll think the same. Yeah, thank you everyone who's watching. And thank you for everyone who came today. I really appreciate it. All right. Have a good evening.